The boardroom was silent except for the soft hum of the projector. I sat in the back, watching the presentation unfold like a play I'd already written but wasn't invited to star in. Madison Winters, the CEO's daughter, stood confidently at the podium, her designer heels clicking against the polished floor as she gestured toward the screen. The presentation was mine. Every slide, every data point, every strategic pivot that had taken 4 months of 16-hour days to perfect. The Revolutionary Market Repositioning Initiative. I had named it that at 2 a.m. one morning, sitting alone in my apartment with 3 energy drinks and a spreadsheet that made my eyes burn. Madison was talking about market penetration rates, demographic targeting, and consumer behavioral patterns. The words were technical, but her delivery made them sound like she'd invented them on the spot. The board members leaned forward, captivated. I watched Richard Ashford, the CEO, beam with pride from his seat at the head of the table. A board member, Mr. Holloway, leaned back in his chair. He was older, gray-haired, with the kind of face that suggested he'd seen a lot of corporate theater before. He didn't look impressed or disappointed. He just looked like he was watching something that didn't quite add up. Madison finished her presentation with a flourish, raising her hands as if she'd personally delivered the results herself. The board applauded politely. Then Mr. Holloway spoke. "Impressive work, Ms. Winters. One question though." I felt my stomach tighten. The room shifted slightly, like the temperature had changed. "Who architected the consumer segmentation model on slide 17? Madison smiled. That easy practice smile. But something flickered in her eyes. I knew the answer. I was the only one who knew the answer. My hand stayed perfectly still as I watched Madison's smile falter for just a millisecond. It was such a small moment that probably no one else noticed. But I'd spent 4 years reading the silent language of boardrooms and offices. I knew exactly what that flicker meant. It meant she didn't know. I kept my expression neutral. My face had become very good at this, at being present while remaining invisible. It was a skill I'd perfected over years of watching others take credit for work I'd done. Or in this case, watching someone else do it to me for the first time. Madison recovered quickly. "That was developed collaboratively," she said smoothly, "with input from several team members." The lie was so polished it almost sounded true. But Mr. Holloway wasn't done. He glanced down at a paper on the desk in front of him. A paper I recognized. My paper. The original consumer segmentation framework, dated 5 months ago, with my name clearly printed at the top. "Interesting," he said quietly. "Because according to the documentation we reviewed, this model was architected by a single person on January 15th. It's quite detailed work. Very specific methodology." Madison's laugh was too bright now. Too nervous. "Well, yes, the initial framework was." "Who?" Mr. Holloway asked simply. The room had gone completely silent. Not the comfortable silence of a successful presentation. This was the silence of something breaking. I could feel it like pressure in my ears. Madison's eyes darted toward her father, Richard. I saw the panic flare in them for just a moment before she suppressed it. She was looking for rescue. Looking for him to jump in and save her. I realized something in that moment. I realized that I had spent so long watching her take credit for my work that I'd forgotten something crucial. The work was good. Good enough that someone like Mr. Holloway, someone who actually knew what to look for, would eventually notice that the numbers didn't match the person presenting them. I had built something real. And that realness couldn't be hidden forever. "I'm waiting," Mr. Holloway said, his pen hovering over his notepad. 4 months earlier, the project didn't even exist yet. I was sitting at my desk on a Tuesday morning, drinking cold coffee from the day before, when Richard called an all-hands meeting. His name was Richard Ashford. He was the kind of CEO who wore expensive watches and talked about disrupting the marketplace like it was a spiritual calling. He'd built this company, Ashford Digital, from nothing. 15 years of grinding, scaling, and actually knowing what he was doing. But somewhere around year 12, he'd lost his edge. Or maybe he'd just gotten tired. Either way, the company had started to stagnate. The market was shifting. Younger competitors were eating our lunch. The board was getting nervous. And then Madison came home. She'd been finding herself in California. That's what people said when their adult children moved away and didn't have actual jobs. She was 28, beautiful, and had something like 300,000 followers on Instagram. Richard looked at his daughter like she was the answer to all his problems. He announced the meeting at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday. By 10 a.m., I knew my life was about to change. "We need a complete market repositioning," Richard announced. He was pacing at the front of the room like he always did. "We're bleeding market share to younger brands. We need to understand why. And we need to fix it before Q3. The room was full of department heads. I was the director of analytics. I'd been at Ashford Digital for 6 years, and I was good at what I did. Really good. The kind of good that doesn't get noticed because the work just flows and nobody questions it. "I'd like to introduce someone," Richard continued. "My daughter, Madison. She's joining us as a strategic consultant. I want her to lead this repositioning initiative." Madison stood up. She was wearing a white linen dress and had the kind of effortless confidence that only comes from a lifetime of not being told no. She smiled at the room like she was gracing us with her presence. "I've been studying brand psychology," she said. "And I think what Ashford Digital needs is a complete reinvention. Not just what you do, but how you're perceived." The room nodded like this was profound wisdom. I stayed quiet and took notes. The first collaboration meeting was where everything started to shift. Madison came to my desk on Wednesday afternoon. She was holding an iced coffee and smiling like we were old friends meeting for lunch, not co-workers being forced together for a high-stakes project. "So," she said, perching on the corner of my desk, "my dad says you're the numbers person. That you're really good at digging into data and finding patterns." I nodded carefully. I'd learned to be cautious with people who led with compliments. "I need your help with something," she continued. "I have all these ideas about the market repositioning, but I don't know how to actually back them up with data. You can do that, right? Make sure everything I'm proposing is actually supported by the numbers." On the surface, it sounded reasonable. She had the big picture vision. I'd provide the analytical framework. We'd work together. What actually happened was different. I spent the first week analyzing every metric we had access to. Consumer behavior, purchase patterns, demographic shifts, brand perception. I built spreadsheets that mapped everything out. Where our market was failing, why it was failing, and what would need to change to fix it. It took 40 hours of work. I brought Madison the results on Friday afternoon. "This is amazing," she said, scrolling through my analysis. "Can I take this? I have a consultant friend who's really good at visual design. I want to present some of this to my dad." I should have said no. Looking back, that was the moment I should have drawn a line. But I didn't. I gave her the files. I showed her how to navigate the analysis. I explained the methodology behind each conclusion. "You're a lifesaver," she said, actually hugging me. It felt genuine in that moment. Like we were going to be friends. Like this was going to be a real collaboration. I had no idea that I'd just handed her the blueprint to my own invisibility. The first public win came 3 weeks later, and nobody told me it was coming. Richard called another all-hands meeting. Madison was there, looking elegant and prepared. She had a presentation. "We've identified several critical market misalignments," she said, clicking through what were unmistakably my slides, my analysis, my conclusions. The data was exactly as I'd presented it to her. But something was different now. She'd added her own narration. She was telling the story of the data in a way that made it sound like the insights had come from her vision, with the data simply supporting what she'd already figured out. "I noticed that our brand was being perceived as outdated by millennials," she explained. "So I analyzed our customer data to confirm the hypothesis." The hypothesis was mine. The analysis was mine. The conclusions were mine. But she was presenting it like she'd started with an intuition and then used my data to validate it. It was a subtle reframing, but it changed everything. It made her the visionary and me the technician. The one with the brilliant idea versus the one who could make spreadsheets. Richard nodded along proudly. The board members who were in the meeting made notes. I watched people react with genuine interest to work I'd done, credited to someone else. And I said nothing. After the meeting, Madison found me at my desk. "I should have asked your permission before presenting those," she said. "But Dad was so excited. And I thought this was our collaboration? I thought we were a team." I wanted to say something. I wanted to correct the record. But she'd framed it perfectly. She'd implied that my silence was consent. That we were teammates. That I should want her to succeed because our success was shared. It's fine, I heard myself say. I'm just glad the analysis was helpful. She squeezed my arm. You're the best. Seriously. I couldn't do this without you. I watched her walk away, and I realized something terrifying. I believed her. And I hated myself for believing her. 2 days later, Madison came to my office and closed the door. She did it carefully, quietly, like we were about to share a secret. I need to talk to you about something, she said, sitting across from me. What I did in that presentation. I felt weird about it afterward. I waited. The thing is, she continued, Dad is really stressed about the company. He's been dealing with the board pushing him to make changes, and I think my involvement, presenting the repositioning strategy, I think it's been helping him feel like there's hope again. Like there's a fresh perspective that gets it. She was so sincere. That was the thing about Madison. She could deliver absolute manipulation with complete sincerity. I know the ideas came from our collaboration, she said. And I know you did a lot of the analytical work. But if I come out right now and say that it was all you, it undermines the whole thing. Does that make sense? I understood exactly what she was saying. If I took credit now, it would look like I was trying to steal her spotlight. It would make me look jealous or petty. I'd spent 3 weeks as a silent collaborator, and now if I spoke up, I'd be the one creating drama. So here's what I'm thinking, she continued. Let's just keep doing what we're doing. You develop the strategy. I present it and get the credit. But you'll know. I'll know. And when this is done, when the repositioning is successful, maybe we can talk to Dad together and make it clear that this was a team effort. It sounded so reasonable. So fair. We could even say it's a temporary optics thing, she added. Just while we're building momentum. Once everyone is invested in the strategy, then we can reframe it. I agreed. I actually agreed to that. I nodded, and Madison smiled like she'd just solved something really complicated. She probably thought she had. She probably thought she'd successfully manipulated me into silence, and now we both had a story we could live with. But I think what actually happened was that I made a choice. A choice to step back. A choice to watch. A choice to document everything. Because some part of me already knew this would matter later. Over the next 6 weeks, the work escalated. Madison's role expanded. She was in more meetings making bigger decisions, and the project became more and more about the vision she was supposedly presenting. Except there was no vision that was actually hers. Every strategic decision, every market insight, every pivot toward a new demographic, I had analyzed it, modeled it, proven it with data. And then Madison would take it to the next level. She would present it to the board or to Richard or to other departments like it had originated from her understanding of the market. I was like an invisible engine powering her locomotive. The strange part was that I kept doing it. I kept analyzing. I kept building the frameworks. I kept creating the strategies. And every single time, Madison would come to me, thank me profusely, and then go present it as her work. By week 6, I wasn't even angry anymore. I was something else. Something colder. I started documenting everything. Not in a vindictive way. Just thoroughly. I created a file on my personal computer with dates, times, and descriptions of every piece of analysis I'd done. I saved copies of emails where I'd sent her preliminary work. I took screenshots of my spreadsheets before she presented them, showing the timestamps. I wasn't planning anything. I was just preparing. Like I was gathering information for a story I might need to tell someday. One afternoon, Madison came to my desk and mentioned something casually. Hey, my dad's been talking about promoting me. Like actually making me a VP of strategy. What do you think about that? I looked at her. She was genuinely excited. She believed her own narrative so completely that she actually thought she deserved it. I think, I said slowly, that would depend on what your actual strategic contributions have been. She laughed. She actually laughed like I'd made a joke. Well, obviously all of this. The repositioning. The market analysis. Everything we've been working on together. Right, I said. Everything we've been working on together. But she wasn't hearing the emphasis. She was only hearing what she wanted to hear. The company-wide announcement came in an email on a Friday morning. I read it at my desk while eating a sad desk salad I'd made from leftovers. Madison Winters was being promoted to Vice President of Strategic Initiatives. She would be reporting directly to Richard. Her role would include overseeing the market repositioning project and identifying new growth opportunities. There was a celebration scheduled for that afternoon. Everyone was invited. I watched Madison at that celebration like I was watching a movie. She was glowing, genuinely happy, thanking people for their support. She hugged her father. She gave a speech about fresh perspectives and disrupting the marketplace and being grateful for a supportive team. She didn't mention me once. Not in the speech. Not in conversation. Not in any meaningful way that acknowledged that someone else had built the foundation she was standing on. And I realized something in that moment. I realized that she didn't see it that way. In her mind, she had probably rewritten the narrative so completely that she actually believed she'd done the work. She'd taken my analysis and made it her vision so many times that the original version of events had simply disappeared from her memory. Or maybe she just didn't care. Maybe she'd never believed we were collaborators. Maybe she'd known from the beginning that she was taking something that wasn't hers, and she'd been fine with it the whole time. I left the celebration early. I went back to my desk and looked at my files. Everything was there. Every piece of work. Every timeline. Every email. I didn't know what I was going to do with it yet. But I knew that I was going to keep it. And I knew that someday, it might matter. That night, I went home and cried in my apartment. Not because I was hurt. Well, not just because of that. But because I'd made a choice, and the choice had consequences I was only now understanding. I'd chosen silence. And silence had a cost. I didn't expect anyone to notice. But Marcus Chin did. Marcus was a senior analyst on my team, and he was smart. Sharper than most people gave him credit for. He came to my desk one afternoon and closed the door very quietly. "I know what's happening," he said simply. I almost lied. My first instinct was to protect Madison, to protect myself, to keep the narrative intact. But looking at Marcus, I realized he already knew. He'd been watching the same thing I had. "Okay," I said. "The repositioning initiative," he continued. "The strategy, the analysis, the frameworks. Madison is presenting it, but you built it. I can tell because I've seen your work before. I know how you think. And I know she doesn't think like that." I didn't respond. "Here's what I'm going to say," Marcus continued. "Document everything. Not because you need it for revenge or to prove anything. But because you need to protect yourself. Because people like Madison, they're fine with ambiguity as long as it serves them. But the moment things go wrong, they'll rewrite the story again. They'll say you didn't actually contribute. Or you didn't do it right. Or you were a team and your role was just to execute." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because I've seen this before," Marcus said. "And I watched the person it happened to not document anything, and when the project failed, they got blamed for the failures while the credit taker walked away clean. So I'm telling you. Write it down. Dates, times, descriptions, and save copies. Somewhere safe. Somewhere that has timestamps." After he left, I sat at my desk for a long time. I wasn't sure if I was angry at Madison or at myself. Or at Richard for creating this dynamic by bringing his daughter into the company and treating her like she was suddenly an expert at something she'd never done before. But I started being more systematic about my documentation. I created a spreadsheet with every major piece of work, dated and time-stamped. I saved copies of my initial analyses before they went to Madison. I made notes of conversations and decisions. I wasn't planning to use it. At least, that's what I told myself. But some part of me knew that Marcus was right. Something wasn't going to end well. And when it didn't, I needed to be able to prove what I'd actually done. The documentation became a strange kind of ritual. Every time I finished a piece of analysis, I'd create a backup copy on my personal computer. Every time Madison came to me with a request, I'd write down what she'd asked for and when she'd asked it. I started printing out key emails and storing them in a folder at home. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would have looked suspicious if anyone had seen it. Just comprehensive records of my own work. One afternoon, while I was building a consumer segmentation model, I realized something. The work itself was good. Really good. It was the kind of work that wouldn't be easily replicated or explained away. It required specific methodological choices and specific technical knowledge. If someone were to actually examine how the model was constructed, they would need to understand the reasoning behind each choice. And Madison didn't understand that reasoning. She couldn't explain it because she hadn't thought it up. That's when I realized the documentation I was creating wasn't just about protecting myself. It was about revealing the truth, if the truth ever needed to be revealed. I stopped thinking about the situation as betrayal and started thinking about it as a puzzle. Madison had taken my work and presented it as hers. But the evidence of my authorship was baked into the work itself. The methodology. The specific analytical choices. The way the data was interpreted. It was all me. And if anyone actually looked, they'd see that immediately. So I kept documenting. And I kept working. And I kept watching Madison present my ideas like they'd originated in her head. But now I was doing it with a strange kind of patience. Like I was waiting for something inevitable to happen. 3 months into the project, things accelerated. The market repositioning was actually working. Consumer perception was shifting. Purchase intent was increasing. The data showed genuine progress. And Madison was being recognized for it everywhere. She was featured in a company newsletter. She was invited to board meetings. She was developing a reputation as a fresh strategic thinker who understood modern consumer psychology. Richard was proud. The board was impressed. The company was thriving. Everything was working perfectly. Madison was growing bolder now. She'd started to stop thanking me even privately. She'd just come to my desk, ask for analysis on something, and then disappear to present it without even a follow-up conversation. One day she asked me to model the impact of changing our brand color palette. I built the model. It took 8 hours. I showed her the analysis. The next day, she presented it to the board as her own observation about color psychology. That night, I added it to my documentation file. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even hurt. I was something colder and sharper than that. I was becoming the person who noticed everything. Who remembered everything. Who kept receipts. There was a board meeting scheduled for the end of the quarter. A presentation about the repositioning initiative's progress. Madison was scheduled to present the results. All the results. The entire narrative of how this project had come together and where it had taken the company. Looking at that scheduled date on my calendar, I knew something was coming. Not because I was planning it, but because the universe has a way of bringing false narratives back around. Doubt crept in on a Tuesday night around 9 p.m. I was still at my desk, building another analysis framework. This one was about long-term strategic positioning. Madison would probably present it to the board. And I'd let her. That was the part that started to get to me. Not that she was taking credit, but that I was letting her. That I was still showing up, still doing the work, still enabling the deception. Why? I could have walked away. I could have found another job. Companies were desperate for good analysts. I could have left this entire situation behind. But I didn't. Was it because I was weak? Was it because I actually cared about Richard and the company's success? Was it because I was terrified of confrontation? Or was it something else? Something darker? Was I staying because I wanted to see how far she'd go? Was I documenting everything not to protect myself, but to gather ammunition for later? I thought about Marcus's advice. Document everything. Protect yourself. But when I looked at my documentation file, I realized it wasn't defensive. It was offensive. I was building a case. A careful, detailed case that proved exactly what I'd done and exactly what Madison hadn't. I wasn't protecting myself anymore. I was preparing evidence. And I wasn't sure if that made me smart or cruel. That night, I went home and sat in my apartment in the dark. I thought about walking away. About just leaving this whole situation behind and finding a job somewhere else where nobody was trying to steal my work or my future. But I didn't do that. Instead, I went to my computer and added more details to my documentation. I organized it by date. I created summaries. I made it so thorough that anyone reading it would understand exactly what had happened. Then I closed the file and sat in the dark some more. The shift came from an unexpected direction. There was a board observer, someone I barely knew. Her name was Patricia Hollings, and she was a consultant brought in to evaluate the company's strategic direction. She'd been sitting in on various meetings, taking notes, observing how decisions were being made. One afternoon, she stopped me in the hallway. "Your work," she said very quietly. "The analytical framework for the repositioning. Can I get the original documentation?" I was careful with my response. "I'd have to check with Madison. She's leading the project." "I'm not asking you to go around her," Patricia said. "I'm asking you to provide me with your original work. The research you did, the methodologies you used, the analytical decisions you made. For the record. For documentation purposes." I looked at her carefully. She was older, professional, and she had the kind of directness that suggested she already knew something was off. "I have it," I admitted. "All of it. Documented and dated." "Good," Patricia said. "Can you send it to me? Just so we have a complete picture of how this project was developed." I sent it to her that night. The entire file. Every piece of analysis, every email, every timeline. Everything I'd been documenting so carefully. I didn't tell Madison. I didn't mention it to anyone. I just sent it and then waited. Patricia didn't respond. She didn't say anything. She just went back to observing meetings and taking notes. But I could feel something shifting. I could feel the machinery of discovery starting to move. I wasn't afraid. I was something else. Something like relief. The board meeting was scheduled for a Friday morning. Madison spent the entire week preparing. I could see it from my desk. She'd taken over the conference room, practicing her presentation, refining her talking points. She came to my desk on Thursday afternoon with one final request. "I need one more analysis," she said. "Can you build a projection for next year's anticipated market share growth based on the repositioning trajectory?" I could have said no. I could have told her I was too busy or that I needed her to work with the analytics department directly now that she was a VP. But I didn't. I built the projection. I spent 4 hours creating the most comprehensive market analysis I'd ever done. I showed her the results. She took it and walked away without a thank you. That night, I saved a copy of that analysis on my personal computer. I added it to my documentation file with a note: "Final analytical contribution to the board presentation." Then I sent an email to Patricia Hollings. I wrote, "I wanted to follow up on the documentation I sent you. In case it's relevant, I wanted to clarify that I authored the entire analytical foundation for the repositioning initiative. I'm providing this not to take credit or to diminish any collaborative efforts, but to ensure the historical record is accurate." I reread it 3 times before sending it. It was professional. It wasn't accusatory. It was just clear. Patricia responded within an hour, "Thank you for the clarification. This is helpful for the record." That was all. Just that. And then I closed my laptop and tried to sleep, knowing that tomorrow, everything was probably going to change. I sat in the back of the boardroom on Friday morning, in the same seat I always occupied. The same invisible seat. Madison was at the podium, looking confident and prepared. She was wearing a dark blazer that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. Her hair was perfect. She looked like a VP. She looked successful. And she looked ready to present my work as her own one more time. "Thank you all for being here," she began. "I want to walk you through the Market Repositioning Initiative and show you how we've successfully shifted consumer perception of Ashford Digital." She clicked through the slides. My slides. My analysis. My insights. "The repositioning began with an observation I made," she said. "I noticed that our brand was perceived as outdated by younger demographics. The observation was mine. I hypothesized that if we shifted our messaging and visual identity, we could capture a younger market," she continued. "The hypothesis was mine. I then conducted a comprehensive analysis to validate this hypothesis. The analysis was mine." She presented the entire narrative as if it had originated from her mind. And for the first time in months, I felt anger. Real. Hot. Immediate anger. But I stayed silent. I stayed still. I stayed invisible. Until Mr. Holloway, the board member with the gray hair and the skeptical face, leaned forward. "Impressive work," he said. "One question though." My heart started beating faster. "Who architected the consumer segmentation model on slide 17? Madison smiled. That easy practice smile. But I saw the flicker. The moment where she didn't know the answer. "That was developed collaboratively," she said. Mr. Holloway looked down at a document in front of him. My document. The original analytical framework with my name clearly printed on it, dated 5 months ago. Interesting, he said. Because according to the documentation we reviewed, this model was architected by a single person on January 15th. Very detailed work. Very specific methodology. Madison's laugh was bright but hollow. Yes, the initial framework was. Who? Mr. Holloway asked. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Madison looked toward her father, Richard. His face had gone pale. He was looking at the document Mr. Holloway was holding, and I could see realization dawning on him. He was starting to understand. The consumer segmentation model, Mr. Holloway continued, his voice calm and measured, is the foundational framework for this entire repositioning strategy. It's what everything else is built on. So I need to understand who actually created it. Madison opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. It was a collaborative process, she tried again. But her voice had changed. The confidence was gone. There was panic now, barely masked. Collaborative in what way? Mr. Holloway pressed. I worked with our analytics team, Madison said. You worked with them, Mr. Holloway repeated. Or they worked with you? The room was completely silent now. Everyone was watching Madison struggle, and they were beginning to realize what that struggle meant. Richard was looking directly at me now. I could feel his gaze, searching, questioning. I didn't look away from my notebook. Mr. Holloway turned a page in the document. The documentation indicates that this consumer segmentation model required specific methodological choices. Very specific. The decision to use a 3-tier demographic clustering instead of the more standard 2-tier approach. The decision to weight lifestyle indicators more heavily than income brackets. These aren't standard analytical choices. They suggest a specific understanding of market psychology. He looked up at Madison. Can you explain those choices? The reasoning behind them. Madison's face had gone white. She started. Because, Mr. Holloway continued, these choices are quite sophisticated. They suggest someone with deep knowledge of behavioral analytics. Someone who understood that Ashford Digital's consumer challenge wasn't about reaching younger people, but about understanding why younger people perceived the brand the way they did. He looked down at the document again. According to the documentation, those choices were made by someone named. He paused, reading. Someone in the analytics department. He looked up at me. Everyone in the room followed his gaze. I felt the shift before I moved. It was like the entire room had suddenly rotated on its axis, and I was no longer invisible. I was suddenly the center of everything. Mr. Holloway was looking at me directly. Is your name on these documents? He asked. I nodded. I didn't trust my voice yet. Can you come up here? He continued. I stood up. I walked to the front of the boardroom, my heels clicking on the floor exactly like Madison's had. But where her footsteps had sounded confident, mine just sounded inevitable. I reached the podium. This analysis, Mr. Holloway said, holding up the document. These are your dates and your signature. Can you walk us through the consumer segmentation model? Not the presentation version. The actual analytical process. Madison had moved to the side of the room, away from the podium. Her father wouldn't look at her. I took a breath. And then I started to explain. I explained why I'd chosen a 3-tier demographic clustering instead of a 2-tier approach. I explained how I'd weighted the demographic variables. I explained the specific research that had led me to understand that Ashford Digital's problem wasn't reaching younger consumers, but understanding why their perception of the brand was what it was. I explained the analytical choices that had taken me 40 hours to make. The research. The methodologies. The reasoning. And as I explained, I could see understanding dawning on the board members' faces. They were beginning to realize what had happened. They were beginning to see that the person who had presented this analysis wasn't the person who had created it. Mr. Holloway listened carefully. He asked detailed questions about my methodology, and I answered every single one. He understood the work because someone like him, someone who actually knew strategy, could tell the difference between someone who understood something deeply and someone who was just reading words someone else had written. When I finished, there was silence. Thank you, Mr. Holloway said simply. And how long have you been doing this analytical work for Ashford Digital? 6 years, I said. This particular project, 4 months. And during those 4 months, who did you report to? I hesitated. This was the moment where I could protect Madison. Where I could soften the blow, make excuses, suggest that it was a collaborative project and everyone was just doing their job. But I thought about that Thursday afternoon when she'd come to my desk with one final request and taken my work without a thank you. I thought about the week of silences and the months of watching her present my ideas like they'd originated in her head. Madison, I said quietly. I reported to Madison for this project. The next voice that spoke was Marcus Chen's. He stood up from where he'd been sitting in the middle of the room. I can corroborate the timeline, Marcus said. I work on the analytics team with... He paused, and I realized he didn't know my name. Or rather, he hadn't known it until I'd just become the center of everyone's attention. I'm Marcus, he continued. Senior analyst. And I can confirm that the consumer segmentation model was developed independently in our analytics department, beginning January 15th. I watched the work develop. I know how it was built. He pulled out his own documents, emails, project timelines, collaboration notes. Every piece of this analysis, Marcus continued, came from the analytics department. Every choice was made there. The presentation of that analysis was then handled by someone else, but the foundational work was done by... He looked at me. By her. The board was looking at Marcus with new understanding. He was corroborating. He was providing evidence.
Richard's lawyer, who'd been sitting quietly in the corner, leaned over and whispered something to Richard. Richard's face darkened. Madison tried to say something. I worked with the analytics team. You received their analysis, Mr. Holloway interrupted. But you didn't conduct it. Is that accurate? Madison didn't answer. Is that accurate? Mr. Holloway repeated. I guided the direction, Madison said weakly. But it was too late. Everyone in the room could see the truth now. The evidence was laid out. The timeline was clear. The authorship was documented. And the person who had presented the work as her own was being exposed. Mr. Holloway looked at Richard. We'll need to discuss what this means for the project governance and the attribution of this work. But for now, I think it's clear that there's been a significant misunderstanding about who contributed what to this initiative. He turned back to me. What's your name? Avery, I said. Avery Coleman. Well, Avery Coleman, he said. You did good analytical work. I hope that's going to be properly recognized going forward. He looked at Madison one more time, and in that look was judgment. Not anger. Just a clear understanding that something had broken here. The meeting continued, but everything had shifted. Mr. Holloway was now asking me questions about the strategy. Not Madison. Not Richard. Me. What had been invisible had suddenly become essential. The board was looking at the repositioning initiative completely differently now. Instead of a fresh strategic vision from a new leader, they were looking at it as solid analytical work that had been misattributed. That changed everything about how they valued it. Instead of being excited about Madison's future potential, they were curious about why Avery Coleman, the person who'd actually created this work, had been invisible. How long has she been in the analytics department? One board member asked Richard. 6 years, Richard said quietly. He wasn't making eye contact with anyone. And what's her track record? Excellent, Richard admitted. So, why wasn't she running this project? The board member asked. If her track record is excellent, and she created the foundational analytical framework for something as important as a repositioning initiative, why is she not the public face of that work? Richard didn't have an answer. I brought Madison on as a strategic consultant, he began. But she's not a strategist. Another board member interrupted. She's a presenter. This work is strategy. And this work comes from the analytics department. The atmosphere in the room had completely flipped. What had been Madison's moment of triumph was becoming her moment of reckoning. And what had been my invisibility was becoming my unexpected visibility. When the meeting finally ended, there was a strange kind of chaos. Board members wanted to talk to me. Richard wanted to talk to me. Marcus was standing nearby, looking satisfied. Madison had left the room as soon as the meeting officially concluded. She didn't say anything. She just walked out. Richard approached me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. It was panic mixed with something else. Something like shame. "Avery," he said carefully, "I owe you an apology." I didn't respond. I was still processing what had just happened. "I should have understood what was happening," he continued. "I should have asked better questions. I should have paid more attention to who was actually doing the work." "You were paying attention to your daughter," I said simply. He flinched at that. "And I let you," I added. I chose silence. "That was my decision." "We'll need to have a conversation about how we move forward," Richard said. "About your role in the company. About everything." I looked at him. He looked genuinely distressed. But I was too tired to care about his distress. "I'd like to take the rest of the day off," I said. "Of course," he said immediately. "Of course." I walked out of the boardroom without looking back. I sat in my car in the parking lot for an hour. I wasn't crying. I wasn't angry. I was just sitting in a state of strange numbness, processing what had happened. Everything had changed. And nothing had changed. I still worked at Ashford Digital. I still had the same title. But the invisible had become visible. The silent had spoken. My phone buzzed. A text from Richard. "We need to talk about your future with the company. This situation needs to be corrected." Another text from Marcus. "That was incredible. You are incredible. Let's get coffee later." No text from Madison. But I hadn't expected one. I sat there and thought about what I wanted. Not what I was supposed to want. Not what Madison wanted or what Richard wanted. But what I actually wanted. Did I want to stay at Ashford Digital? Did I want to move up in this company? Did I want to become the visible, recognized leader of strategy? Or did I want something else entirely? I realized, sitting in my car in the parking lot, that I had no idea. I had spent so long being invisible that I hadn't actually thought about what I wanted to be when I became visible. I drove home and sat in my apartment. I opened my documentation file one more time. All that careful record-keeping. All that evidence. I'd created it to protect myself. To prove my point. But now that the point had been proven, I felt oddly empty. The official outcome came the next Monday in the form of an official email from Richard. He was reorganizing the strategic leadership structure. The market repositioning initiative would now be managed by the analytics department, with full formal leadership attributed to Avery Coleman. Madison would be reassigned to a communications and brand development role, effective immediately. The decision would be announced company-wide by end of business. The email was professional. It was fair. It was exactly what should have happened from the beginning. And I felt nothing. I came to work that morning and found flowers on my desk. From Richard. From several board members. From colleagues who suddenly wanted to know me. "Congratulations," people kept saying. I accepted it all with a nod. Marcus asked me to coffee, and I said yes. We sat in a cafe near the office, and he told me he was happy for me. He said I deserved recognition. He said I was the best analytical mind he'd worked with. "Thank you," I said. But my voice sounded far away. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked. "I don't know," I admitted. I spent so long fighting to be visible. And now that I am, I'm not sure if I wanted this. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I wanted to be recognized," I said slowly. "But I'm not sure I wanted to be recognized here. I'm not sure I wanted it to come at the cost of Madison's humiliation. I'm not sure I wanted to spend my energy proving someone else wrong instead of building something new." Marcus looked at me carefully. "So, what are you going to do?" "I don't know yet," I said. Richard called me into his office on Tuesday afternoon. He was offering me a promotion. Vice President of Analytics and Strategy. A significant raise. A corner office. Everything that had been promised to Madison, redirected to me. "You've earned this," Richard said. I looked at the contract on his desk. "I need to think about it," I said. He looked surprised. "What's to think about?" "Whether I want this," I said simply. "Whether I want to stay here. Whether I want to keep building something that your daughter was going to run into the ground." "Avery." "I'm not angry," I continued. "I'm just tired. I've been spending my energy on this place for 6 years. I've been invisible. And then I was suddenly visible, but only because I exposed someone else's incompetence. And I'm not sure that's a foundation I want to build the rest of my career on. Richard looked genuinely stricken. What would make you want to stay? Honestly, I said, I don't know that anything would right now. I need to take some time to figure out who I am when I'm not fighting to be seen. And I need to decide if Ashford Digital is where I want to be when I figure that out. I stood up and walked out of his office. I had just walked away from everything I'd been working toward, and it felt like freedom. I took 2 weeks off. The company tried to contact me several times. Richard wanted to negotiate. The board wanted to ask me questions about the strategy going forward. I didn't respond. Instead, I sat in my apartment and thought about what I actually wanted for my career, what I wanted for my life, who I wanted to be beyond the person Madison wronged. My identity had been so wrapped up in being invisible and then being vindicated, but there was something hollow about it. I didn't want my entire career to be defined by a moment when I was proven right about something I'd never wanted to be wrong about in the first place. I wanted to build something, not to defend something, not to prove something, but to actually create something new. 2 weeks later, I went back to the office. I submitted my resignation to Richard. 2 weeks' notice. Professional. Final. He tried everything. Higher salary. More power. A promise that Madison would leave the company. But I'd already made my decision. I didn't want to be visible at Ashford Digital. I wanted to be invisible somewhere that mattered more. I started a consulting firm with Marcus. We work with companies on their analytical strategy, not as invisible support behind someone else's presentation, but as the primary architects of the strategy itself. It's different, it's harder, but it's mine. The kindness that looked like weakness became something else. It became evidence of character. When I stayed silent, I was maintaining relationships and allowing for collaboration. It looked like I didn't care enough to fight for recognition. But it was actually something more complicated. It was choosing not to create drama. It was attempting to assume good faith.
It didn't work out that way.
Madison used that silence against me. But the point isn't that silence was wrong. The point is that I learned something crucial. My worth doesn't depend on whether other people recognize it. I spent 4 months being invisible at Ashford Digital. I spent 1 meeting becoming undeniably visible. And I spent weeks afterward realizing that neither state actually mattered as much as I thought it did. What mattered was that I knew what I'd built. What mattered was that I could look at my own work and be satisfied with it, regardless of who was presenting it or who was getting credit. And what mattered was that eventually I stopped needing Ashford Digital to tell me who I was. I'm Avery Coleman, and I'm a strategist. That was always true, whether the rest of the world recognized it or not. Madison is probably fine. She's probably moved on to whatever comes next for people like her. Richard is probably still trying to figure out how to prevent the next crisis. But I'm building something real. Something that's mine. Something that doesn't require invisibility or vindication. That's the real story.